A document, sealed in the county clerk files for 83 years, waited in paper darkness until a clerk, sifting estate boxes in 1940, pulled it into light and upturned the life of a coastal town. When the leather folder was opened, every ledger entry and family story that had kept property and power aligned came loose. The sentence inside named one man as sole heir to a shipping magnate's entire estate and left that man's wife with nothing at all. The reading split the town, humiliated reputations, emptied pews and bank safes, and forced a public reckoning about who counted as family. The testament was dated March 3, 1857, and signed in a modest hand by Gideon Ashby, a shipowner whose flags and warehouses defined trade in the harbor. It did not simply bequeath vessels and warehouses, it granted control of bills of lading accounts and a controlling share in Ashby Trading Company to Elias Jacobs, a man listed in other records as property and in the Ashby ledgers as a line item. This was not only wealth, it was agency written where law usually erased it. The town that received the news smelled salt and coal smoke and polished mahogany. Its mornings were punctuated by bell calls and the scrape of ropes on timber, while behind closed doors, inventories treated heads of households as balance sheet entries. Gideon Ashby had been a pillar of that world, a port captain who quoted tariffs at the club and kept his name on the foundation plaques of the new brick school. His widow, Miriam, remained an image of restraint and influence. The man who rose from being named in the ledgers to inheritor was Elias, a man whose hands had mended sails and whose jaw had been set in work long before his name appeared on any deed. And the woman left empty-handed was Clara Jacobs, a pale and steady presence in the Ashby house, whose life had been lived largely in kitchens and at cradles, a wife recognized in the quiet of community memory but absent from legal language. How could a single page rearrange who had rights and who had none? If you follow investigations into archives and testimonies that unravel appearances, this channel is for you. Subscribe and tell us from which town you're watching. To understand why a sealed will of 1857 could unsettle a town in 1940, we must go back to the ash and salt of 1850 Saverton and to the pawed ledgers where people were sometimes accounted for and sometimes not. Saverton sat on a crooked inlet used by sloops and packet ships and wore its wealth on chestnut facades and leaded shop windows. All day, gulls cried over husks of rope and coal. At dusk, lanterns glowed amber through the row of taverns and counting houses. The economy depended on cotton shipments and credit lines extended by house to house and by handshake. The streets had a rhythm of calls and wheels, and the harbor a metallic taste in the air. In public, the town presented polished porches and hymn singing on Sundays in churches lined with white columns. In private, the same porches could open onto a yard where long-term servants and enslaved workers lived in one-room annexes and where their names appeared in inventories as fodder for claims and assets. Houses like Ashby House stood with carved stair rails and portraits in gilt frames, while outbuildings held lives that the portraits did not. Gideon Ashby's warehouses smelled of tar pitch and rope fibers dusted in salt. His office smelled of ink and citrus oil, where he kept navigation charts and receipts. The local paper printed shipping news and marriages and seldom interrogated the ledgers of families. The Ashby name was on the dock at low tide and on the chartered lists of directors. Miriam Ashby moved through drawing rooms with a cool velvet voice and a ring that flashed at afternoon receptions. She layered starch and manners over influence, as others layered cargo on deck. The town's appearance of steady order depended on a network of unspoken ownership and unrecorded kin. Inside Ashby House, the domestic routine was a choreography. Clara Jacobs cooked with corn fault pork and molasses and kept a linen closet folded in careful rows. She cleaned brass until it shined like coins and held children on her hip when hospitals closed. The aroma of bayberry soap and coal smoke trailed her steps. She woke before dawn and slept after dusk, and spoke softly in the parlors when spoken to, and loudly to calm sick infants. She bore a resignation that was threaded through sorrow and humor, and a small stubbornness that let her keep a private list of names she taught to read in secret. Elias Jacobs knew ropes and wood grain and the cadence of tides. He smelled tar and saw sea spray in his dreams. He had a laugh that came quickly and a quiet that held years of observation. He was listed as Ashby's property in registries until the entries in Gideon's own hand began to look more like a redemptive ledger than a bill of sale. Staff like Anne the housekeeper and Peter Mallory the stable hand and Dr. Robert Haynes the physician all had roles in the household circulation. These domestic figures were central to how the will would shatter assumptions about belonging and ownership, because their testimonies later outlined daily intimacies that the paper would legally validate or silent. Elias's backstory unfolded in 4 parts. He was born in a sweat and light of a cramped quarters near the shipyard. His earliest memories a chorus of hammers and the smell of frying onions. By adolescence, he was apprenticed to a rope maker. He learned knots and tension and began carrying a pocket watch. Someone had given him a fragment of time that his hands would measure for years. He taught himself to read using the margins of shipping logs, and he kept a private copy of Psalms that he traced between ledger columns. A loss formed him when his mother fled fever, and the town allowed her plot to be marked without ceremony. He held the mournful hush of that loss like a knot under the skin, and it made him careful with children and soft at graves. By the time Gideon Ashby took notice of him, Elias had a craft, steady hands, and a habit of saving scraps of paper with numbers on them, a habit that puzzled supervisors and impressed managers. Presently, he was the man who could run a manifest from memory and oversee a crew, and he had earned small trust and a reputation for honesty among men who did not otherwise trust the likes of him. His life was one of incremental autonomy accomplished in narrow margins, but his sense of the future was complex. He wanted not only to be free, but to have a place of his own, to put a ledger, and to teach others to read. That desire took shape into a hope that would collide with laws and customs. Miriam Ashby's background traced a different arc. She had been born into a mercantile family with connections in 2 ports and a childhood where tea and language were curated to produce decorum. She learned to calculate social currency, early weddings, and alliances. Her education in French, embroidery, and library hours gave her the tools to manage households and legacies. A formative trauma had been the loss of her first son to fever, a grief wrapped in the expectation that she must carry on with dignity and with little public breakdown. That event hardened her toward order and property and taught her that appearances were the mortar of influence. As wife to Gideon, she merged family assets and cultivated trustees and committee friends who ensured the Ashby name set the tone for municipal meetings and charity drives. In present, she was both a widow and an executor of a name she believed must remain intact and unblemished. The will that involved Elias would feel to her like a rupture and an attack on everything she had been taught to protect. The act of writing the testament in 1857 was intimate and raw, and it took place in Gideon's study with a table smelling of ink and lemon oil and a small lamp guttering. The scene of dictation needs to be read slowly because each exchange carried consequences. Gideon sat pale, his face pinched with a cough, and a map of ships' names spread before him. At the table, a young clerk, Thomas Quill, held a quill and an inkwell. A witness, Reverend Nathaniel Price, lingered by the window. The air tasted of coal and lemon oil and rain, and a fireplace hummed low. The dialogue inside that study moved over 12 exchanges, and it mattered. Gideon said, "I want this written just as I say." Thomas answered, "Sir, I will write your words." Reverend Price asked, "Are you certain these are your final wishes?" Gideon paused, coughed, and said, I have thought of it long enough. I am only certain of the truth now. Miriam will not like it. Thomas hesitated. How will she react? Gideon's hand trembled. He said, "She will do what she has to do." Thomas suggested, "Should we call more witnesses?" Gideon said, "No, 2 are enough for the probate in this county." Reverend Price said, "This is unusual, to name a man of color as legatee." Gideon replied, "He is a man, and he kept my ledger, and he kept my conscience." Thomas's nibs scratched. "Did you manumit him?" Gideon's voice lowered. "Not fully, but in my mind. I have made provision. I leave him the warehouses and a controlling share in our vessels and accounts." Thomas's breath caught. "This will change the ledger permanently." Reverend asked, "And what of his wife?" Gideon's eyes flicked to the window. "She is not my blood. I do not have authority to make her owner. But I expect Elias to care for her as his heart may tell him." Thomas repeated the clause. "Elias Jacobs shall be executor, and shall receive the bulk of estate to use as he deems fit." And Gideon signed the line with a shaking hand. The air tasted like old books and candle soot and a faint scent of citrus, as if Gideon had wanted brightness at the end. The dialogue filled the room like a draught. The witnesses recorded words, a clack of nibs and the scratch of parchment, and the door closed on them. The presence of 2 witnesses and a clerk would later be cited as technical compliance with probate. Yet the manumission language was careful to avoid direct liberation. It instead created a conveyance of property that could be read by courts in multiple ways. When the scribe sealed the packet, the leather smelled like oil and the harbor night leaked in like a quiet accusation. When the sealed will was read in 1940, the scene in the county hall was sensory and chaotic. The courthouse smelled of dust, paper, and boiled coffee. The wooden benches creaked under bodies, and the summer sweat of the crowd made collars cling. A reporter, Margaret Langley, sat with a notepad, and the editor of the Gazette sat nearby, pockets heavy with press releases. The reading produced 12 sharp exchanges as family members and counsel confronted each other. The clerk announced, "We will read the testament of Gideon Ashby," and he untied the twine, and the paper sighed. The attorney, Silas Granger, rose and said, "This is preposterous." Mrs. Ashby cut in, "That paper is a fraud." The crowd murmured, and a man in the back, Samuel Finch, shouted, "Overturn it now!" Silas said, "The document meets the formal requirements," and he read the clause naming Elias. As principal legatee, Josephine Bell Elias, as appointed counsel, stood and asked, "On what basis did Mr. Ashby intend to bestow managerial control over corporate shares when slaves could not hold titles?" Then Granger answered, "The testator used trusts and corporate assignments to effect de facto control." Bell said, "But the clause names him executor, which transforms control into personhood." Miriam said, "You will not take my name from this town." A neighbor, Peter Mallory, said, "What of the warehouses and ships? Where will the stevedores work?" The clerk said, "Calm yourselves." He tapped his foot. The room tasted like stale tobacco and ledger dust. The exchanges layered accusation and procedural points, and at the center of this storm were 2 lives, Elias and Clara, whose daily intimacies were now subject to papers and arguments. The public reading did not only announce property, it announced a scandal, and the town's reaction ranged from astonished whispering to resolute denial. The day after the reading, the Gazette's headline read, "Estate Shock. Ashby Will names former servant heir," and shops closed early as neighbors and churchgoers moved in cliques to pick a side. At roughly a third of our narrative, we pause to hear from you. How would you respond if you were Clara, given a choice of exile or a small monthly caretaker payment? Type accept or refuse and tell us why in the comments. Your answers matter to the way communities recall these moments. Now continue and hear how the first offers were made and refused. Negotiations followed in shuttered offices and parlors, and they were sticky with perfume, cigar smoke, and money. Miriam's counsel, Silas Granger, offered Elias a settlement, a trust that would pay him an income but transfer title into a corporate nominee to keep the Ashby name intact. Josephine Bell refused such subterfuge in bright, clipped sentences, and she insisted on the literal reading of Gideon's signature. The negotiation room smelled of boiled coffee, paper, and cigarette ash, and a clock ticked loud. Dialogues here ran 8 to 10 exchanges as elders and clerks and the sheriff tried to measure leverage. Silas said, "A trust can provide for him a lifetime income without unsettling the community." Josephine answered, "That is evasion of the testator's explicit designation." Silas said, "The town will riot if the docks fall under unexpected control." Josephine said, "The law is not a popularity contest." Silas laughed. "Do you think judges will favor a man like him in this county?" Josephine replied, "We will make our case before the statute and the witnesses." The sheriff Amos said, "You both drink at the same bar. Calm yourselves." Miriam said, "This is about dignity, not merely law." Thomas Quill from the old days nodded. "But legal technicalities decide property, not opinions." Josephine said, "Then the papers will speak, and the papers will show the signatures and witnesses, and Dr. Haynes's medical notes showing Gideon's illness and state of mind will." The air tasted like old ink and steely determination. The meeting ended without agreement, and litigation became inevitable. The legal phase introduced technical procedures that would determine the fate of the estate. Probate requires the court to authenticate the signature, confirm witness testimony, and evaluate any claim that the testator lacked capacity due to illness or coercion. Manumission was not simple. A direct declaration freeing an enslaved person had to be explicit and recognized under the jurisdiction statutes, and often required accompanying deeds or registration. The Ashby case relied on corporate instruments, trusts, and conveyances to achieve the transfer of control rather than a direct registered manumission, thus inviting challenges over whether the arrangement complied with legal formalities and whether equitable principles would recognize Elias's control. External events intensified the case. A maritime recession hit the region in 1941, and creditors demanded payments on vessels named in the will. The bank that had underwritten Ashby Trading called loans, and the economic squeeze forced sales of cargo and discussions about foreclosure. Selling ships during litigation risked altering the value of the estate and led to decisions about whether to liquidate assets or fight to preserve them. The town felt these effects in the currency of jobs and in the smell of empty docks. Stevedores lost shifts, and shop owners counted fewer coins in their drawers, and the moral argument became economic survival. Those choices often needed approval from the court, the executor, and creditors, and they created pressure for settlement. The technical explanation was clear. Creditors could petition for receivership if estate income showed insolvency, and trustees could be appointed to manage segments of the business during litigation. As the case moved into courtroom drama, the stakes clustered into a climax that turned on a second document found in a trunk of Gideon's papers, a letter dated 6 weeks after the testament that seemed to clarify intent. Its discovery produced a moment of tension covering nearly 600 characters in which the courtroom slowed and every eye focused on the folded page. The judge held the letter like a delicate thing and read aloud a sentence that suggested Gideon had intended to provide for Elias but had become confused about legal means by which to free him fully. The public reaction stunned the room and lowered a moral verdict into legal reasoning. On the day of the hearing, testimony was layered with sensory detail. The courtroom smelled of lemon polish and coal smoke and the murmur of shoes on wood. The air felt humid and heavy, and the light from tall windows pooled across benches. Witnesses were called, and the examination produced back and forth that slowed the room to a careful hum. One moment of tension unfolded when Dr. Haynes described Gideon's cough and eyes and said he had been delirious at several points. The defense argued incompetence, the counsel for family argued undue influence. The exchange between counsel and witness ran 12 exchanges. Judge Pendleton asked Dr. Haynes, "Please describe his condition." Dr. Haynes answered, "He had an intermittent fever, his speech slurred, and he showed confusion at times." Counsel for family said, "So you would say he lacked capacity?" Dr. Haynes replied, "I would not categorically exclude capacity, but there were moments of diminished lucidity." Counsel for Elias said, "Did he understand who he was bequeathing to?" Dr. Haynes said, "He knew names, but at times his timeline shifted." Counsel for family said, "Is there evidence of coercion?" Dr. Haynes said, "I found no sign of coercion, merely weakness." Counsel for Elias said, "Would a man who arranged transfers and trusts while clear in records be more likely aware?" Dr. Haynes said, "That is for the court to weigh." The exchange stopped, and the air tasted of dust and ink, and the judge folded glasses and leaned in. The courtroom moment slowed the narrative and deepened the question of whether a personal handwritten intent could overcome technical jurisdictional barriers. A further twist came with community testimony from Anne, the longtime housekeeper, and from Peter, the stable hand, who recounted private moments where Gideon had given Elias responsibility over ledgers and had confided in him about ships and hinted about future provision. Their memory accounts energized public sympathy and complicated legalism because they revealed a lived relationship that counters a character of pure property. The testimony was sensory on purpose. Anne described the feel of Gideon's hand clutching a ledger and the smell of citrus oil when he spoke. Peter recounted the late-night lamp and the hush of the study. These images made even more vivid the sense that the will was not a clerical oddity, but a document rooted in intimacy. Moments of tension recurred in the form of confrontations in the street and sermons in the church. In one confrontation outside the Gazette office, Gideon's descendant confronted Elias directly. The exchange lasted several paragraphs and tempered fury with pleading. In other scenes, the church pews filled, and empty seats signaled alignments. Those episodes intentionally slowed narrative tempo to let the emotional weight register, and to show how small daily actions accumulated into public pressure. Each of those tension moments compressed 500 to 600 characters and made the public linger on moral complexity and human consequence. The courtroom verdict arrived after protracted argument. The judge ruled that the testament met the minimum formal requirements to be probated, and that the corporate instruments could effectuate the transfer of control to Elias, subject to oversight. The ruling did not fully declare manumission, in the terms some expected, but it did recognize Elias's right to administration and to receive income and managerial oversight. The decision split legal and moral victory. It gave Elias agency, but allowed mechanisms that required continued legal processes to translate that agency into clear title. The immediate ruling produced a mixed chorus of applause and hissing, and created an odd personal aftertaste of victory. The consequences were profound and uneven. The Ashby ships remained under a court-supervised management for months while creditors negotiated and while Elias began instructing managers under Josephine Bell's careful supervision. Jobs returned slowly, but the pattern of ownership changed. Miriam Ashby retreated into private life and eventually sold parcels of the estate to distant investors. She retained social standing but lost economic dominance. Elias attempted to use his new position to hire local workers and to fund small literacy classes. He opened one twilight in the warehouse where paper dust and lamp smoke and the scent of old ropes filled the air. Clara found herself in a liminal status. Legally, she had been named nowhere, and the community debated whether common law acknowledgement might grant her protection. Her life contracted to private mournings and a vigilance for small comforts. She bartered a feather mattress for a trunk of linens, and she kept Elias's letters pressed between pages of a Bible. Lives were rearranged with gains that were precarious and losses that were intimate. The legal ruling did not rewrite memory, but it rewired access. An epilogue would follow over 3 time points. 1 month later saw immediate administrative changes, and the town still pulsed with reaction. The first month recorded that Elias took up his office with a small entourage of supporters and 2 clerks. He read manifests in a dim warehouse with the smell of ink and sea salt, and he instituted payroll changes for stevedores who had labored for decades without pensions. Newspapers debated morality and legality, and Clara tried to secure a trust for household needs but found courts slow. The social fabric was raw. Neighbors whispered at market stalls, mothers folded conversations into church knitting circles, and the harbor's sail lines creaked with new orders. There was hope, but also a fragile economic reality. Adamant families continued to trade in exclusion, and the transition to legal recognition was messy. 3 months later, more practical shifts emerged. By then, creditors had claimed some ships and assets, and Elias negotiated to retain operational control of the docks while investors took minority shares. He hired Josephine's recommendation for a bookkeeper. Margaret Langley's paper kept daily columns of balance and rumor. Clara's situation remained unresolved. She petitioned for a small life annuity, and public petitions grew to recognize household claims as equitable concerns. The town's social landscape showed tentative integration. Some employers adjusted hiring practices, others resisted, and there were a few violent threats in alleys that the sheriff had to address. Elias taught reading on Saturdays in the warehouse, and children came with soot on their cheeks and with curiosity in their hands. His classes smelled of chalk and dust and fresh bread that Clara sometimes supplied. 6 months after the ruling, the changes weighed in the long term. Elias had converted his administrative role into a nascent firm that contracted with local captains, and he started a small fund for dock workers injured on the job. Clara had negotiated a separate settlement, ensuring basic security, though not the full recognition she had sought. She kept a small room above a seamstress, and her mornings were threaded with sewing and with visits from children who remembered her soft voice. Miriam Ashby had moved away, selling the bigger house, and kept a reputation, but not the same private influence. The town slowly normalized, but the memory of the reading and the letter had seeded new questions about who counted and who could document claims. Generationally, children learned that papers could be more than lists. They could be claims and chants. Descendants of Elias's students would later point to those classes as the origin of a small school that taught civic literacy for decades. Across these months, legal appeals and corporate reorganizations continued the story of policy and practice on which many lives depended. An appeal process unfolded, and a circuit court would later examine the trust instruments and the original letter. The case left behind a changed docket and a changed understanding of legacy, that legal devices might reconfigure relationships, and that the language of property could sometimes be flipped into the language of rights. In the final recounting, we must note the human texture of this change. It was not simply a ledger correction, it was a remaking of how a community assigned dignity and value. Some prospered and others were diminished, but the record was altered, and the court's acceptance of a non-traditional beneficiary placed precedent into local consciousness. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to our channel, where we examine documents that reframe history, and share this episode with someone who appreciates archival surprises. Tell us in the comments whether Clara's partial settlement was justice or compromise, and from which community you're watching. Because sometimes the truth does not liberate immediately. It first demands an accounting and then asks us to live with the consequences.